The stagecoach rattled to a stop outside the Breckenridge station in Colorado Territory on a sweltering July afternoon in 1878, and Victoria Monroe stepped down into the dust with her heart hammering against her ribs, clutching a worn leather satchel that contained everything she owned and a faded daguerreotype of the man she was supposed to marry. She had never met Thomas Jennings in person, only through letters that had grown increasingly infrequent over the past 6 months. Their arrangement had been brokered by her aunt back in Philadelphia, a practical solution to Victoria's sudden orphanhood and Thomas's need for a wife in this rough mountain town where respectable women were scarce. At 22 years old, Victoria had exhausted her options back east. Her parents had died within months of each other the previous winter, leaving her with debts she could not pay and distant relatives who made it clear she had overstayed her welcome. The mountain air was thinner here than she had expected, and she paused to catch her breath, looking around at the muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings. Breckenridge was smaller than she had imagined, nestled in a valley surrounded by peaks that still held snow even in summer. Gold mining had brought people here, Thomas had written, though the easy gold was mostly gone now. He worked as a carpenter, building homes for the miners and merchants who continued to believe in the town's future. "Miss Monroe." A deep voice spoke behind her, and Victoria turned quickly. The man standing there was not Thomas Jennings. She knew this immediately because the photograph she carried showed a man with pale hair and a thin face. This man was dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He held his hat in his hands and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am Victoria Monroe. Are you here on behalf of Thomas Jennings?" Something flickered across the man's face, gone before she could name it. "I am Yates Jennings," he said quietly. "Thomas is my brother. I have come to take you to him." Relief washed through her, though she felt suddenly aware of how this man was looking at her, as if he were memorizing her features. "Thank you, Mr. Jennings. I hope the journey was not too inconvenient for you. Just Yates, please." He reached for her satchel and their fingers brushed briefly. Victoria pulled her hand back as if burned. "Thomas could not come himself. He is unwell." Alarm replaced relief. "Unwell? What is wrong with him?" Yates's jaw tightened. "It is better if we speak of this on the way. I have a wagon waiting." He gestured down the street to where a sturdy wagon stood hitched to 2 horses. As they walked, Victoria became aware of eyes watching them from doorways and windows. A woman in a bright dress leaned against a saloon entrance, her painted lips curving in a knowing smile. Victoria lifted her chin and kept walking. She had not come all this way to be intimidated by frontier gossip. Yates helped her onto the wagon seat with surprising gentleness for such a large man, then swung up beside her and took the reins. The horses started forward at his command, and they left the main street behind, heading up a winding road that climbed into the pine-covered hills. For several minutes, neither spoke. Victoria gripped the edge of the seat as the wagon bounced over rocks and ruts. Finally, she could bear the silence no longer. "How serious is Thomas's illness?" Yates did not look at her, his attention seemingly fixed on the road ahead. "He took a fall 3 weeks ago, hit his head badly. The doctor says he has been improving, but he gets terrible headaches and sometimes his vision goes blurry. He has not been able to work." "Oh, that is dreadful." Victoria's hand went to her throat. "I had no idea." His last letter said nothing about any accident. That letter was written before it happened. Yates paused, then added, "Thomas does not know you are arriving today." The letter telling him the date of your arrival never reached him before his accident, and afterward he was in no condition to read anything for some time. Victoria felt cold despite the afternoon heat. So he does not know I am coming at all. He knows you are coming eventually. Just not today. Yates finally glanced at her, and she saw concern in his expression. I did not want you to arrive at the station with no one to meet you. Thomas had mentioned the arrangement to me months ago, so when I found the letter in his things last week with your travel details, I knew someone needed to be there. That was thoughtful of you. Victoria studied his profile, seeing the resemblance to Thomas now, though Yates was harder-edged, more roughly hewn. Do you live near your brother? I have a cabin about 2 miles from Thomas's place. I am a horse breeder and trainer. I built my cabin farther out where I have room for pastures and corrals. He shifted the reins to one hand and gestured toward the mountains rising around them. This is beautiful country, but it takes some getting used to if you are from the city. Philadelphia, Victoria said. Though I grew up on my grandfather's farm before my parents moved to the city, I am not entirely ignorant of rural life. One corner of Yates's mouth lifted in something that was almost a smile. That will help. Thomas's house is comfortable enough, but it is not fancy. He built it himself 2 years ago. They rode in silence again, and Victoria found herself watching Yates's hands on the reins, capable and sure. She forced herself to look away, focusing instead on the scenery. The pine forest gave way occasionally to open meadows filled with wildflowers, and once she saw a deer watching them from the tree line, its ears pricked forward. The sun was beginning to sink toward the mountain peaks when Yates turned the wagon onto a narrow track that led through the trees. After another quarter-mile, they emerged into a clearing where a small but well-built log cabin stood, smoke rising from its chimney. A vegetable garden grew in a fenced plot to one side, and a shed leaned slightly to the left, as if contemplating whether to remain standing. Yates brought the wagon to a stop and sat for a moment, his hands still on the reins. Thomas is a good man, he said without looking at her. He will treat you well. Before Victoria could respond, the cabin door opened and a figure appeared. Thomas Jennings was thinner than his photograph suggested, his pale hair disheveled, and even from a distance, Victoria could see the careful way he moved as if his head pained him. He squinted at them in the fading light, one hand shading his eyes. Yates. His voice was uncertain. What brings you here? Yates climbed down from the wagon and came around to help Victoria descend. She felt his hands at her waist, strong and steady, and then she was standing in front of the cabin, facing the man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry. Thomas, Yates said quietly, this is Miss Victoria Monroe, your intended. Thomas's face went blank with shock. He took a step forward, then stopped, swaying slightly. Victoria, but I did not know when you were coming. I never received the letter with your travel details. Victoria moved toward him instinctively, concerned by his pallor. I am sorry to arrive without warning, Mr. Jennings. Your brother found the letter and was kind enough to meet me at the station. I understand you have been unwell. I took a fall. Thomas touched the side of his head gingerly. Still recovering, but you should not have come, not now, not while I am like this. I had nowhere else to go, Victoria said simply, meeting his eyes, and we had an arrangement. If you no longer wish to honor it, I will understand, but I would appreciate at least a few days to rest and plan my next steps. Thomas looked from her to Yates, seeming overwhelmed. Of course you must stay. I am not rejecting you. I just wish you could have seen me at my best, not like this, not when I can barely think straight half the time. Then it is fortunate that thinking straight is not a requirement for hospitality, Victoria said gently. I am tired from my journey, and I imagine you are tired from your injury. Perhaps we could save the serious conversations for tomorrow. Yates retrieved her satchel from the wagon. I will bring this inside for you. Thomas, do you have a place for Miss Monroe to sleep? There is a room I built for storage, but it has a cot and a window. I can move some things around." Thomas rubbed his forehead, wincing. "I am sorry, I am not managing this well." "You are managing fine, given the circumstances," Victoria said firmly. She had dealt with her father's final illness, had nursed her mother through pneumonia. She recognized the signs of a man in pain trying to maintain his dignity. "Please, do not trouble yourself. Just show me the room and I will make myself comfortable." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly neat, with a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a sleeping area separated by a curtain, and a smaller room that Thomas led her to, apologizing for the stack of lumber and boxes of nails and tools that took up half the space. Victoria assured him it was perfectly adequate and meant it. She had feared worse. Yates set her satchel on the cot and looked around the cramped space with a frown. "Thomas, I am going to help you clear some of this out before I leave. There is no reason Miss Monroe should have to climb over building supplies to reach her bed." "I can manage," Thomas protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can barely stand without swaying," Yates said bluntly. "Sit down before you fall down. I will handle this." Victoria watched as Yates proceeded to move the lumber and boxes out to the shed, making several trips. Thomas sank onto a chair in the main room, looking miserable. Victoria busied herself exploring the cabin, finding a pump for water at the kitchen counter, a well-stocked pantry and evidence of a man who, despite living alone, tried to maintain some order in his life. "May I make some coffee?" she asked Thomas. "I suspect we could all use some." "That would be kind of you." Thomas managed a weak smile. "I apologize for my condition. This is not how I imagined your arrival." "Life rarely matches our imaginings," Victoria said, locating the coffee in a pot. "We must work with what we are given." She set about making coffee with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had kept house for her invalid parents. The familiar motions were soothing, giving her something to do while her mind raced. Thomas seemed kind enough, but he was clearly in no condition to make major decisions about marriage. And Yates kept appearing in her peripheral vision as he worked, his movements economical and purposeful, and she found herself far too aware of him. When Yates finished clearing the room, he came to stand in the kitchen area, wiping his hands on his trousers. "That is better. The room is small, but at least you can move around in it now." "Thank you," Victoria said, pouring coffee into 3 tin cups. "You have been very helpful." Their eyes met over the steaming cups, and Victoria felt something shift in her chest, an unwelcome flutter of awareness. She looked away quickly, handing a cup to Thomas. They sat awkwardly in the main room, sipping coffee as the light faded outside. Thomas tried to make conversation, asking about her journey, but his attention kept drifting and he would lose his train of thought mid-sentence. Finally, Yates stood. "I should head back before full dark. Thomas, I will come by tomorrow to check on you both." He looked at Victoria. "If you need anything, my place is 2 miles north along the main trail, then west where you will see a painted wooden sign with a horse on it. Anyone in town can give you directions as well." "Thank you, Yates," Victoria said. "I appreciate everything you have done today." He nodded, put his hat on, and left. Victoria heard the wagon creak as he climbed aboard, then the sound of hoofbeats fading into the evening. Thomas set his cup down and looked at her apologetically. "I should let you rest. I am sure you are exhausted. We can talk properly tomorrow when my head is clearer." "That sounds wise," Victoria agreed, though she felt wide awake, her nerves humming with the strangeness of her situation. She was alone in a cabin in the Colorado mountains with a man she had never met, who she was supposedly going to marry, but who could barely hold a conversation. It was absurd and frightening, and she refused to let herself think about how utterly vulnerable she was. She washed the coffee cups and went to her small room, closing the door behind her. The cot was narrow, but the blanket was clean, and the window looked out on the darkening forest. Victoria sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the daguerreotype of Thomas, studying it in the last of the light. He looked different in person, worn down by pain and illness. But that was not what troubled her. What troubled her was that she kept thinking about Yates, about his hands on her waist as he helped her from the wagon, about the way he had looked at her as if she were a puzzle he needed to solve. This was not how the story was supposed to go. She was meant for Thomas. That was the arrangement, the practical solution to her problems. She could not afford to complicate things with foolish romantic notions about his brother. Victoria changed into her nightgown and lay down on the cot, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thomas moving around in the main room, the creak of his bed as he settled down. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind would not be still. She had been so certain that coming west was the right decision, the only decision. Now she was not certain of anything at all. Morning came early, announced by birds and the sound of Thomas moving around outside. Victoria dressed quickly in one of her 2 remaining good dresses, a simple gray cotton that had seen better days but was still respectable. She braided her dark hair and pinned it up, then emerged from her room to find Thomas building up the fire in the stove. He turned when he heard her and attempted a smile. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Well enough, thank you." Victoria studied him in the morning light. He still looked pale, but his eyes were clearer than they had been the night before. "How is your head today?" "Aching, but not as badly as yesterday. The mornings are usually better." He straightened carefully. "I was going to make breakfast, but I will be honest, I am not much of a cook. I usually just have coffee and whatever bread I have around." "Then let me cook," Victoria said, moving past him to assess the pantry. She found flour, salt, some dried bacon, and eggs that were probably from a neighbor's chickens. It was enough. "Sit down and rest. I will have something ready shortly." As she worked, Thomas sat at the table and watched her. "I am glad you are here," he said quietly. "Even if the circumstances are not ideal, it has been lonely living out here by myself." Victoria cracked eggs into a bowl. "Tell me about your work. You are a carpenter." "I was. I am not sure when I will be able to work again." Frustration edged his voice. "The doctor says I need more time, but I have projects half finished, people waiting, and now you are here and I have no income to support a wife." "I am not helpless," Victoria said, whisking the eggs briskly. "I can work too if necessary. I kept house for my parents, did sewing for neighbors, sold vegetables from our garden. I will not be a burden to you." "That is not what I meant." Thomas leaned his elbows on the table. "You should not have to work. A man should provide for his wife." "Then perhaps we should not rush into marriage until you are recovered," Victoria suggested, slicing bacon onto the griddle. The fat began to sizzle and pop. "We barely know each other, Thomas. Would it not be wiser to take some time, let you heal, and see if we suit each other before making anything official?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That is very practical of you and probably wise, but people will talk, you staying here unmarried." "People will talk regardless," Victoria said. "They always do. The question is whether we care." "I care about your reputation." "My reputation was already compromised the moment I stepped off that stagecoach as a mail-order bride," Victoria said bluntly. "I am past the point of worrying about gossip. I am more concerned with making a good decision about the rest of my life." Thomas laughed, then winced and touched his head. "You are very direct. I appreciate that. All right, we will take our time. But I want you to know I do want to marry you. I wrote those letters in good faith." I need a partner in this life, and I think we could be good together." Victoria plated the eggs and bacon and brought them to the table. "Then, let us start by being friends and see where that leads us." They ate breakfast in more comfortable silence, and afterward, Victoria insisted on cleaning up while Thomas rested. She was washing the dishes when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Looking out the window, she saw Yates riding into the clearing on a beautiful chestnut mare. Her heart did an unwelcome leap in her chest. Yates dismounted and looped the reins over the porch rail, then knocked once before entering. "Morning," he said, pulling off his hat. His gaze went to Thomas. "You look a bit better today." "Feel a bit better too," Thomas admitted. "Miss Monroe made an excellent breakfast. Please, both of you, call me Victoria," she said, drying her hands on a cloth. "Miss Monroe sounds far too formal given the situation." Yates's eyes met hers, and she saw something warm there, something that made her pulse quicken. "Victoria, then. I came to see if either of you needed anything from town. I am making a supply run this afternoon." "That is thoughtful of you," Victoria said. She was about to decline when she realized this might be her only chance to see Breckenridge properly, to get her bearings in this new place. "Actually, I would appreciate a chance to see the town if you would not mind the company. I should introduce myself to people, perhaps find out if there is any work available." "Work?" Yates frowned. "Thomas is supposed to be providing for you." "Thomas is recovering from a head injury and cannot work," Victoria said calmly. "And we have decided to delay any marriage plans until we know each other better. In the meantime, I need to make myself useful." She saw something shift in Yates's expression, a flash of what might have been relief or approval, gone too quickly to name. "I see. Well, if Thomas does not object, I would be glad to take you to town." Thomas waved a hand. "I have no objection. In fact, I was thinking Victoria might like to meet the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Carson. She is always looking for help with various charitable projects, and she knows everyone in town. She could make introductions." "That is an excellent idea," Victoria agreed, though the thought of explaining her situation to a minister's wife made her slightly nervous. Still, she needed allies here, and she was not too proud to seek help where she could find it. An hour later, Victoria was seated beside Yates on his wagon, heading back down the mountain toward Breckenridge. She had changed into her better dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and pinned her second-best bonnet over her braided hair. Yates had changed too, she noticed, into a clean shirt and vest, though his boots were still dusty from ranch work. "Tell me about the town," Victoria said as they descended the winding road. "Thomas mentioned that mining brought people here, but that the easy gold is gone." "That is true," Yates said. "There is still gold in the mountains, but now it takes more work, more investment to get at it. Some miners have done well. Others barely scrape by. The town has about 500 permanent residents now, maybe more. We have a school, 2 churches, several saloons, a newspaper, a doctor, all the trappings of civilization. And your horse ranch, how did you come to that?" "I grew up around horses. My father was a horse trader back in Missouri. When Thomas and I came west 5 years ago, he wanted to be a carpenter and I wanted to breed horses. We each bought land and built our places." Yates paused. "Our parents died when we were young. We only had each other for a long time." "I am sorry," Victoria said softly. "I lost my parents recently too. It is a hard thing." Yates glanced at her. "Is that why you agreed to come here, to marry Thomas?" "Partially. My parents died in debt. I had no way to pay what was owed. My relatives made it clear I was a burden. When Thomas's letters offered an alternative, I took it." Victoria folded her hands in her lap. "I am not ashamed of it. We all do what we must to survive." "I am not judging you," Yates said quietly. "I admire your courage." It takes strength to leave everything you know and travel across the country to an uncertain future. Or desperation, Victoria said wryly. Strength and desperation often look alike. Yates's mouth quirked. I think you have both. They fell into a comfortable silence as the wagon rumbled down the mountain. Victoria found herself relaxing despite her uncertainty about the future. There was something steady about Yates, something that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in a long time. When they reached Breckenridge, Yates drove straight to a tidy white church at the edge of town. A neat house stood beside it, and Yates helped Victoria down from the wagon, his hands at her waist again, and she tried not to notice how warm they were through the fabric of her dress. The Reverend Carson and his wife are good people, Yates said as they walked to the door. They will help you if they can. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair answered their knock. Yates Jennings, what a pleasant surprise, and you have brought a guest. Mrs. Carson, this is Victoria Monroe. She has come from Philadelphia to marry my brother Thomas, but Thomas had an accident and is recovering, so they are delaying their plans. Victoria is new to town and thought you might help her get acquainted with people. Mrs. Carson's eyebrows rose, but her smile did not waver. How lovely to meet you, dear. Please come in. Yates, will you join us for tea? I have supplies to buy, but I could come back in an hour if that suits. Perfectly, Mrs. Carson said, already ushering Victoria inside. I will take excellent care of Miss Monroe. Victoria glanced back at Yates as he left, feeling suddenly nervous without him nearby. But Mrs. Carson was already leading her into a cozy parlor and settling her into a comfortable chair. Now then, Mrs. Carson said, pouring tea from a porcelain pot, tell me everything. Start from the beginning and do not leave anything out. I may be a minister's wife, but I am also a woman who understands that life rarely goes according to plan. Victoria found herself doing exactly that, explaining about her parents' deaths, the debts, the letters from Thomas, the journey west, and her arrival to find Thomas injured and unable to work. Mrs. Carson listened without interrupting, her face thoughtful. So you see, Victoria finished, I need to find work at least temporarily. I can sew, keep house, tend gardens, teach children if needed. I am not afraid of hard work. I can see that, Mrs. Carson said warmly. And I think I can help. Mrs. Patterson, who runs the boarding house, has been looking for someone to help with cooking and cleaning. The gold strikes have brought in more people and she is overwhelmed. The pay is modest but fair. Would that interest you? Very much, Victoria said, relief washing through her. When could I start? I will take you to meet her this afternoon if you like. But first I must ask, what do you think of Thomas Jennings? Is he the sort of man you could be happy with? Victoria hesitated. I barely know him. He seems kind, but he is so unwell right now that it is hard to judge. I told him we should wait, get to know each other properly before making any commitments. Very wise. Mrs. Carson studied her over the rim of her teacup. And Yates? He is a good man, very different from his brother. Thomas is gentle and cautious. Yates is stronger, more decisive. They both have their virtues. Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks. Yates has been very kind and helpful. Mrs. Carson said, and Victoria had the distinct impression that the older woman saw far more than Victoria wanted her to. Well, let us go meet Mrs. Patterson, shall we? Then I will introduce you around town a bit before Yates returns. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of introductions. Mrs. Patterson, a brisk widow in her 50s, hired Victoria on the spot to start the following Monday. Mrs. Carson then walked Victoria through town, stopping to introduce her to the shopkeepers, the doctor, the schoolteacher, and half a dozen other residents. Victoria's head spun with names and faces, but she did her best to remember them all. When Yates returned, Victoria was standing outside the general store with Mrs. Carson, laughing at some story the older woman was telling. Yates pulled the wagon to a stop and smiled at the sight of them. "You look like you are settling in well," he said as Victoria climbed up beside him. "Mrs. Carson has been wonderful, and I have a job starting Monday at the boarding house." Victoria settled her skirts around her. "Thank you for bringing me to town. This was exactly what I needed." They said their goodbyes to Mrs. Carson and headed back up the mountain. The sun was high now, warm on Victoria's shoulders. She felt more hopeful than she had since arriving. Work would give her purpose and income, and time would tell whether she and Thomas could build something together. But as they drove, she found herself acutely aware of Yates beside her, the easy way he handled the horses, the strength in his weathered hands. She forced herself to look away, focusing on the scenery instead. "Thank you for today," she said quietly. "You have been kinder to me than you needed to be." Yates was quiet for a moment. "I am glad I could help," he said finally. "Thomas is my brother and I want him to be happy. But I also think you deserve to be happy, Victoria. Do not forget that when you are making your decisions." Something in his voice made her turn to look at him, but his attention was on the road ahead, his expression unreadable. They spent the rest of the ride in silence, but it was not uncomfortable. When they reached Thomas's cabin, Victoria thanked Yates again and went inside to find Thomas dozing in his chair. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake him, and set about preparing a simple lunch. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Victoria cooked and cleaned, tended the garden and cared for Thomas, who was gradually improving but still had bad days when the headaches returned with force. Yates came by every afternoon, always with some excuse, checking on his brother, bringing fresh meat from a hunt, needing to borrow a tool. Victoria began to suspect the excuses were just that, excuses, but she said nothing. She was keenly aware of the growing tension between what she was supposed to feel and what she actually felt. Thomas was kind and grateful for her help, and they had pleasant conversations when his head was clear. But there was no spark between them, no quickening of her pulse when he entered the room. With Yates, it was entirely different. Every time he appeared, her heart jumped. Every accidental brush of hands made her skin tingle. She tried to hide it, tried to be proper and appropriate, but it became harder each day. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, Yates brought a string of trout he had caught in the stream near his property. Thomas was napping, and Victoria was in the garden, pulling weeds. She looked up at the sound of hoofbeats and saw Yates dismounting. "Fresh fish for supper," he said, holding up the string. "Thought you might appreciate a change from bacon." "That is thoughtful, thank you." Victoria stood, brushing dirt from her hands. She was wearing her oldest dress, her hair coming loose from its braid, and she felt suddenly self-conscious. "I must look a mess." "You look like you have been working hard," Yates said, his eyes warm. "There is no shame in that." He helped her clean the fish at the pump, showing her the best way to scale and gut them. They worked side by side, and Victoria was intensely aware of his nearness, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed hers, the sound of his breathing. "Victoria," he said suddenly, his voice low. "I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, her heart pounding. "What is it?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again, frustration crossing his face. "Never mind, it is not my place." "Yates, what is wrong?" He set down the knife he had been using and turned to face her fully. "I do not think you should marry Thomas." Victoria's breath caught. "What? Why would you say that? Because you do not love him." Yates's gaze was intense, searching her face. "I see how you are with him. Kind, caring, but there is no passion there. You are treating him like a patient, not a future husband." "He is still recovering," Victoria said, but her voice shook. I cannot expect passion when he is in pain. It is more than that, and you know it. Yates stepped closer. You do not look at him the way you look at me. Victoria's face flamed. How dare you presume to know how I look at anyone? Am I wrong? She wanted to deny it, to be outraged, but the words would not come. Instead, she stood frozen, staring up at Yates, her heart hammering so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. I was meant for your brother, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. That was the arrangement. That was the plan. Yates smiled then, a slow, tender smile that made her knees weak. Fate clearly had better plans for us. The words hung in the air between them. Victoria knew she should step back, should be scandalized, should remind him of propriety and duty and all the things that said this was wrong. But she could not move, could barely breathe. Yates, she began, but did not know how to finish. I know I have no right to say any of this, Yates continued, his voice rough with emotion. You came here for Thomas, and he is a good man, probably better than me in most ways, but I cannot stop thinking about you, Victoria. From the moment I saw you step down from that stagecoach, I have thought of little else, and I think maybe you feel something too. It does not matter what I feel, Victoria said desperately. I made a commitment to your brother. A commitment to marry him, yes. But you said yourself that you are taking time, waiting to see if you suit each other. That means nothing is final yet. Yates reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. I am not asking you to do anything dishonest. I am just asking you to be truthful with yourself about what you want. Victoria closed her eyes against the touch, afraid of what she might do if she kept looking at him. This is impossible. Thomas is your brother. How could we ever? Thomas is not in love with you either, Yates said quietly. He wants a wife, a partner, someone to share this life with. But there is no passion on his side any more than on yours. If you are both just looking for companionship, for practical partnership, then yes, you could have a decent marriage. But do you really want to settle for decent? Victoria opened her eyes and found Yates watching her with such intensity that her breath caught. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting that you give yourself permission to consider other options, that you let yourself feel what you feel without guilt. His hand was still against her cheek, warm and steady. I am suggesting that sometimes fate knows better than our plans. Before Victoria could respond, they heard the cabin door open. They sprang apart like guilty children, Yates turning back to the fish and Victoria hastily wiping her hands on her apron. Thomas appeared in the doorway, squinting against the afternoon light. Yates, I thought I heard your voice. Victoria, is everything all right? Fine, Victoria said, her voice too bright. Yates brought fish for supper. I was just learning how to clean them properly. That was kind of him. Thomas came down the steps carefully. My head is feeling better today. I was thinking I might walk down to the woodpile, start assessing what projects I could begin working on again. Take it slow, Yates cautioned. You do not want to push too hard and set yourself back. As the brothers talked, Victoria excused herself and went inside, her hands trembling. She busied herself preparing vegetables to go with the fish, trying to calm her racing thoughts. What had just happened? Had Yates really just told her he had feelings for her? Had she really stood there and not denied that she felt the same? This was a disaster. She had come here to marry Thomas, to solve her practical problems with a practical solution. She could not afford to complicate things with romantic feelings, especially not for Thomas's own brother. It would hurt Thomas, would create a rift between the brothers, would make her the subject of vicious gossip. There was no scenario where this ended well. But even as she told herself all this, she could not stop thinking about the look in Yates's eyes, the feeling of his hand against her face, the way her whole body had come alive at his touch. That evening they ate the fish together, the three of them sitting around Thomas's table. The meal was delicious, but Victoria barely tasted it. She was too aware of Yates across from her, of the way his eyes kept finding hers, of Thomas sitting beside her, oblivious to the tension. After dinner, Yates excused himself early, claiming he needed to get back to check on his horses. As he was leaving, he caught Victoria's eye and she saw the question there, saw him asking her to think about what he had said. She gave no answer because she had none to give. That night, Victoria lay awake on her narrow cot, staring at the ceiling. She could hear Thomas snoring softly in the next room, a man who had offered her security and stability when she had nothing. A man who deserved honesty and respect. But when she closed her eyes, it was Yates she saw. Yates she imagined reaching for. Yates who made her heart race and her skin warm and her whole self feel more alive than she had felt in years. She had come west to escape an impossible situation, only to find herself in one even more complicated. And she had no idea what to do about it. The next morning, Victoria rose early and made breakfast with grim determination. She would focus on practical matters. She would start her job at the boarding house on Monday, would earn her own money, would give Thomas time to recover fully. And she would keep her distance from Yates Jennings, no matter how difficult that proved. But fate, it seemed, had other ideas. Victoria started work at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house the following Monday, rising before dawn to walk the 2 miles into town. Thomas had offered to drive her in his wagon, but Victoria preferred to walk, needing the exercise and the time alone with her thoughts. The boarding house was a sprawling 2-story building on Main Street, always full of miners and prospectors passing through. Mrs. Patterson ran it with brisk efficiency, and Victoria quickly learned the routine. Cooking breakfast for however many guests were in residence, changing linens, washing dishes, preparing lunch and dinner, more dishes, more cleaning, and finally collapsing into bed in the small room Mrs. Patterson provided for her off the kitchen. Victoria had told Thomas she would return to the cabin on her days off, but in truth, she welcomed the excuse to put some distance between herself and the impossible situation there. If she was not at the cabin, she could not see Yates. If she could not see Yates, she could not feel this terrible pull toward him. She threw herself into work, finding satisfaction in the exhaustion that claimed her each night. Mrs. Patterson praised her efficiency and soon was giving her more responsibility, letting her plan menus and manage the kitchen on her own. The work was hard, but it was also freeing. For the first time since her parents' deaths, Victoria had her own income, her own purpose beyond being someone's burden or someone's prospective wife. Thomas came to town twice that first week to visit her. They had coffee at the boarding house kitchen, and he told her about his slowly improving health, about starting to take on small carpentry projects again. He was kind and seemed genuinely interested in how she was managing. "You look well," he said during his second visit. "Tired but well." "The work agrees with you." "It does," Victoria admitted. "I like having purpose, like earning my own way." Thomas studied her thoughtfully. "You do not need my permission, but I want you to know that I think this is good for you, for both of us, actually. It takes the pressure off, lets us figure out what we want without desperation driving our decisions." "Thank you for understanding," Victoria said, touched by his perception. "I have been thinking," Thomas continued slowly, "that perhaps we have been approaching this wrong from the start. We have been trying to force something that may not be natural between us. You came here expecting to marry me, and I expected to marry you, but neither of us has stopped to ask whether we actually want that." Victoria's heart sank and soared simultaneously. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I think we make good friends, Victoria, but I do not think we would make a good marriage." Thomas reached across the table and took her hand, his grip gentle. "I see the way my brother looks at you, and I see the way you try not to look at him." Victoria felt heat flood her face. "Thomas, I never meant to. I know you did not." He squeezed her hand. "You have been nothing but honorable. But feelings are not something we can control, and I would rather set you free now than trap you in a marriage where you will always be wishing for someone else." Tears pricked Victoria's eyes. "You are a good man, Thomas Jennings, far better than I deserve." "Nonsense. You deserve to be happy, and I think Yates could make you happy if you give him the chance." Thomas released her hand and sat back. "I am giving you my blessing, Victoria. Pursue what your heart wants. I will be fine. But the gossip, people will say terrible things about all of us. People who matter will not care, and people who care do not matter." Thomas smiled. "Besides, Mrs. Carson has already been dropping hints to various ladies in town that you and I have decided we do not suit, and that you will be remaining in Breckenridge as a working woman rather than as my wife. The groundwork for your reputation is already being laid." Victoria laughed through her tears. "Mrs. Carson is formidable. That she is." Thomas stood. "I should get back. I have work to do, but Victoria, before I go, do not waste time feeling guilty. Life is too short and too uncertain. If you care for Yates, tell him. Do not let pride or propriety rob you of happiness." After Thomas left, Victoria sat alone in the quiet kitchen, her mind whirling. She felt relieved, guilty, excited, and terrified all at once. Thomas had just released her from their informal engagement. She was free to pursue Yates if she wanted. The question was, did she dare? She did not have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, Yates walked into the boarding house dining room during the lunch service. Victoria was serving soup to a table of miners when she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, hat in hand, his eyes searching the room until they found her. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. She finished serving the soup with shaking hands, then made her way over to where Yates stood. "What are you doing here? I heard from Thomas that you and he have called things off." Yates's voice was low, meant only for her ears. "Is it true?" "Yes," Victoria whispered. "We decided we suit better as friends than as husband and wife." Something fierce and joyful flashed in Yates's eyes. "Then I have a question to ask you, and I will not take no for an answer." "What question? Will you let me court you properly?" "No secrets, no guilt, just honest courting with the intention of seeing if we have a future together." Victoria glanced around the dining room. Several of the miners were watching them with open curiosity. Mrs. Patterson stood in the kitchen doorway, her eyebrows raised. There would be talk, Victoria knew. There was always talk. But Thomas had been right. People who mattered would not care. And the people who cared did not matter. She looked back at Yates and felt a smile tug at her lips. "I would like that very much." Yates's answering grin transformed his face. "Good. Then I will be here on your next day off to take you on a proper outing." "When is that?" "Sunday afternoon." "Sunday it is." He put his hat back on and tipped it to her. "I will see you then, Victoria." He left, and Victoria stood there feeling like she was floating. Around her, the dining room buzzed with speculation, but she did not care. Let them talk. She had just agreed to be courted by a man who made her heart sing, and nothing else mattered. Mrs. Patterson appeared at her elbow. "That was Yates Jennings, was it not? Thomas's brother?" "Yes, madam." "And you are stepping out with him now, not Thomas?" "It appears so." Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. "Good. Thomas is a nice boy, but he is too soft for you. Yates has more spine. You need a man who can match your strength." Victoria blinked, surprised. "You do not think it is improper?" "My dear, I have been running a boarding house in a mining town for 15 years. I have seen every possible variation of improper. A woman changing her mind about which brother to marry barely registers. Mrs. Patterson patted her arm. Now get back to work. Those miners will not feed themselves. Victoria did as she was told, but she moved through the rest of the day in a daze of happiness. She had not felt this light, this hopeful, since before her parents fell ill. It was as if the world had suddenly opened up with possibilities instead of closing in with obligations. When Sunday came, Victoria took extra care with her appearance. She wore her blue dress, the one that brought out her eyes, and borrowed a nicer bonnet from one of the other girls who helped at the boarding house. When Yates arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, driving a small buggy pulled by one of his beautiful horses, Victoria was waiting on the front porch. He helped her up into the buggy, and she caught the scent of him soap and leather and pine. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. "Thank you. Where are we going?" "I thought I would show you my place if that is all right with you. I want you to see what I am building, what my life looks like." He paused. "And I promise to behave like a gentleman. Mrs. Patterson is welcome to come along as chaperone if you prefer." "I trust you," Victoria said simply, and saw pleasure flash in his eyes. They drove out of town and up into the hills, taking a different road than the one that led to Thomas's cabin. The day was beautiful, warm but not hot, with a breeze that smelled of pine and wildflowers. Yates told her about his week, about the new colt that had been born, about a deal he was negotiating to sell horses to a ranch down in Denver. Victoria found herself relaxing, laughing at his stories, asking questions about his work. This felt easy in a way things had never felt easy with Thomas. With Yates, conversation flowed naturally, without the awkward pauses and careful politeness that had marked her interactions with his brother. After about 30 minutes, they turned onto a narrow track that led through aspen groves. The trees gave way suddenly to a wide meadow, and there, at the far end, stood a cabin larger than Thomas's, with a barn and several corrals where horses grazed peacefully. "This is my place," Yates said, a note of pride in his voice. "I have been building it up for the past 5 years. I have 20 horses now, and I am working on breeding a line that combines the stamina of wild Mustangs with the size and temperament of working horses." He drove them to the cabin and helped Victoria down. She looked around, taking in the neat corrals, the well-maintained barn, the garden plot behind the cabin, the mountain views in every direction. "It is beautiful," she said honestly. "You have built something real here." "I want to build more," Yates said, watching her carefully. "I want a family someday, children running through these meadows, a wife who shares my dreams." He stepped closer. "I want to build a life with someone who chooses to be here, not someone who came out of desperation or obligation." Victoria met his eyes. "I did come here out of desperation," she said quietly. "I will not pretend otherwise. But staying, choosing where my heart leads me, that is not desperation. That is hope." Yates's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek. "I have been wanting to touch you like this since that first day at the station. Do you know how hard it has been, watching you with Thomas, knowing I had no right to any claim on you?" "I have some idea," Victoria whispered, her own hand rising to rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady under her palm. "I kept telling myself to be sensible, to honor my commitment, to ignore what I was feeling. But every time I saw you, sensible seemed less and less important. I was meant for your brother," she continued, the words tumbling out. "That was the plan, the arrangement. I should not feel this way about you." Yates smiled then, that slow smile that made her knees weak. "Fate clearly had better plans for us." And then he was kissing her, his lips gentle at first, then more insistent as she responded. Victoria's hands slid up around his neck, and she kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. This was what she had been missing, this connection, this spark that made everything else fade away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I am courting you properly," he said, his voice rough. "No rushing, no pressure. But Victoria, you should know that my intentions are serious. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you, and I will wait as long as it takes for you to be sure." "I am already sure," Victoria said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I have been sure since that day you taught me to clean fish, maybe even before that. I was just too afraid to admit it." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that I was being foolish. Afraid that what I felt was not real. Afraid of hurting Thomas." She pulled back enough to look into his eyes. "But Thomas set me free. He told me life was too short to settle for decent when I could have happiness. And he was right." "Thomas is wiser than I gave him credit for," Yates said, stroking her hair. "But he is also right. Life is too short, and I am too selfish to let you go now that I have you." They spent the rest of the afternoon at Yates's ranch. He showed her the horses, introducing her to each one by name and personality. Victoria had grown up around animals on her grandfather's farm, and she was not intimidated by the large creatures. She ran her hands down their silky necks, laughing when a young mare tried to nibble her bonnet ribbons. "She likes you," Yates said, grinning. "That is Willow. She is particular about people." "Then I am honored," Victoria said, stroking Willow's nose. They walked through the meadow, Yates pointing out where he wanted to expand the barn, where he planned to build additional corrals. He talked about his dreams for the ranch, for breeding horses that would be sought after across Colorado and beyond. Victoria listened, asking questions, offering suggestions from her own limited experience with livestock. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, they sat on the cabin porch, and Yates brought out coffee and some bread and cheese. They ate and talked, and Victoria felt a contentment she had not known in years. "This," she thought, "this is what I have been looking for, not just security or stability, but partnership with someone who saw her as an equal, who valued her thoughts, who made her feel alive." "I should get you back before dark," Yates said reluctantly as the sky began to color with sunset. "I do not want to damage your reputation." "A bit late to worry about that," Victoria said wryly. "I suspect the entire town is buzzing with gossip about us by now." "Probably," Yates admitted. "Does that bother you?" "Not as much as I thought it would," Victoria said. "I suppose I am learning that living for other people's approval is exhausting. Better to live for what makes me happy. That is a good philosophy." They drove back to town in the twilight, sitting close together on the buggy seat. When they reached the boarding house, Yates walked Victoria to the door and took her hand. "May I see you next Sunday as well?" "Yes," Victoria said, "and perhaps during the week if you find yourself in town." "I will find myself in town often," Yates promised. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, his eyes holding hers. "Thank you for today. Thank you for giving us a chance." "Thank you for being persistent," Victoria said, "and for seeing something in me worth pursuing." "I see everything in you," Yates said softly. "Everything I have ever wanted." He left her there on the porch, her hand tingling from his kiss, her heart full. Over the next several weeks, Yates courted Victoria with single-minded dedication. He came to town twice a week, always with some small gift wildflowers he had picked on his ride in, a book he thought she would enjoy, a hair ribbon in blue to match her eyes. They took walks along the creek that ran through Breckenridge, attended church together on Sundays with Mrs. Carson beaming at them from her pew, and spent long afternoons at his ranch where Victoria was learning to ride one of his gentler mares. The gossip did swirl, as Victoria had predicted. There were those who clucked their tongues over the impropriety of a woman switching brothers, who whispered that Victoria must be calculating and manipulative to have orchestrated such a thing. But there were also many who saw the truth that Victoria and Yates simply fit together in a way that Victoria and Thomas never had. Thomas himself helped matters by being openly supportive. He came to town one Sunday and made a point of greeting Victoria and Yates together, shaking his brother's hand and telling them both that he wished them every happiness. His public blessing went a long way toward quelling the worst of the gossip. "You did not have to do that," Victoria told him privately, "but thank you." "I meant what I said before," Thomas replied. "I want you both to be happy. And besides, I have realized something. I was not looking for passion any more than you were. I was looking for companionship, someone to help me build a life out here. There are other women who might be better suited for that than you are." "Oh," Victoria smiled. "Anyone in particular?" Thomas colored slightly. "Maybe Mrs. Carson has been introducing me to her niece, who recently moved to town. Sarah is quiet and gentle, and she does not make my head spin the way you and Yates spin each other. I think maybe that is what I need." "Then I hope it works out," Victoria said warmly. "You deserve happiness too, Thomas." As autumn began to paint the aspen trees gold, Yates asked Victoria to marry him. He did it simply, without grand gestures, on a Sunday afternoon at his ranch. They were sitting on the porch watching the horses graze, Victoria's hand in his, when he turned to her and said, "I do not want to wait any longer. Marry me, Victoria. Make this place our home. Make your life with me." Victoria's throat tightened with emotion. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Yates pulled her into his arms and kissed her, deep and thorough, and Victoria felt the last of her fears fall away. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. They were married 6 weeks later in October when the mountains blazed with color. The ceremony took place in Reverend Carson's church, with most of the town in attendance. Victoria wore a new dress of deep green wool that Mrs. Patterson and several of the other women had helped her sew. Yates wore his best suit and looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Thomas stood as Yates's best man, and if anyone found that strange, they kept their opinions to themselves. Mrs. Carson cried happy tears. Even some of the gruff miners who stayed at the boarding house had cleaned up and come to witness the union, grinning broadly as Yates and Victoria exchanged vows. "I promise to love you all my days," Yates said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "To build a life with you, to weather whatever storms come our way. You are my partner, my equal, my choice." "And you are mine," Victoria replied, her own voice thick. "I came west looking for security and found so much more. I found love, found purpose, found home. I promise to stand beside you, to build our dreams together, to choose you every day for the rest of my life." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed Victoria to enthusiastic applause and several whoops from the miners. They walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, out into the golden October sunshine. The reception was held at the boarding house, where Mrs. Patterson had outdone herself with food and decorations. There was music and dancing, and Victoria found herself passed from one partner to another, laughing and breathless. But her eyes always found Yates across the room, and his always found hers, and the message was clear. They were eager for this celebration to be over so they could begin their real life together. Finally, as evening fell, they were able to slip away. Yates had borrowed a decorated buggy from a friend, and they drove through the twilight to his ranch, their ranch now, with tin cans tied to the back, rattling cheerfully. The cabin glowed with lamplight when they arrived. Yates had clearly been here earlier in the day, because there were flowers in vases, The fire was laid and ready to light, and their bed was made up with new linens that Victoria had sewn herself in preparation for this night. Yates helped Victoria down from the buggy and then, to her surprise, swept her up in his arms. "I want to do this properly," he said, carrying her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jennings." "Welcome home, Mr. Jennings," Victoria replied, her arms around his neck. He set her down inside and closed the door behind them, and then they were alone, truly alone for the first time as husband and wife. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the weight and wonder of what they had done settling over them. "I love you," Yates said softly. "I know I have said it before, but I want to say it now here at the beginning of our life together. I love you, Victoria. You are everything I did not know I was looking for." "I love you too," Victoria whispered. "When I stepped off that stagecoach 2 months ago, I was terrified and alone. I thought I was coming here to settle for a practical arrangement. Instead, I found you, found love, found myself." Yates drew her close, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise. Victoria kissed him back, letting herself sink into the feeling, into the rightness of being in his arms. They made love that night with the kind of passion that comes from waiting, from choosing each other despite obstacles, from knowing that this was real and rare and worth fighting for. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Victoria's head on Yates's chest, his fingers trailing lazily through her hair. "Tell me what you are thinking," Yates murmured. "I am thinking about fate," Victoria said. "About how I was meant for your brother but ended up with you. About how the best things in my life have been the unplanned ones. Do you regret any of it? The confusion, the awkwardness, the gossip?" "Not for a moment," Victoria said firmly. "It all led here, and here is exactly where I want to be." "Good," Yates said, pulling her closer. "Because here is where you are staying." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and when Victoria woke in the gray dawn to the sound of horses whinnying outside and Yates breathing steadily beside her, she felt a peace she had never known. This was home. This was love. This was her life now. The first year of their marriage was both harder and sweeter than Victoria had expected. Running a horse ranch required constant work, and Victoria threw herself into it alongside Yates. She learned to mend fences, to doctor sick horses, to keep the books and manage the finances with the practical efficiency she had developed keeping house for her parents. She also discovered that marriage was not always easy, even when you loved someone deeply. There were disagreements about money, about how to expand the ranch, about whether to take certain risks. Yates could be stubborn when he believed he was right, and Victoria was discovering that she could be equally stubborn. But they learned to talk through their differences, to compromise, to choose their partnership over their pride. The town fully accepted them as a couple as the months passed. Thomas married Sarah Carson in the spring, and Victoria and Yates attended the wedding with genuine happiness for the couple. Sarah was exactly what Thomas needed: gentle, content with domestic life, undemanding of passion, but offering steady companionship. Thomas looked more relaxed than Victoria had ever seen him. "We all ended up where we were supposed to be," Thomas said to Victoria at the reception, watching his new wife chat with Mrs. Carson across the room. "I am glad you followed your heart instead of our arrangement." "So am I," Victoria said. "Thank you for being understanding, Thomas. Not many men would have been." "I am learning that love takes many forms," Thomas replied. "What I have with Sarah is different from what you have with Yates, but it is real and it is good. That is what matters." Victoria returned to the ranch that night and told Yates about the conversation. They were lying in bed, the window open to let in the cool spring breeze. "Thomas is happy," Victoria said. "Really happy. I am so glad." "He deserves it," Yates said. "We all do." "We do," Victoria agreed. She turned in his arms to face him. "Yates, I need to tell you something." His eyes searched hers in the moonlight. "What is it?" "I am with child." She felt him go still, and for a moment she worried about his reaction. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming it with joy. "Truly." "Truly?" "I am about 2 months along, I think. I wanted to be certain before I told you." Yates pulled her close, his hand splaying protectively over her still flat stomach. "A baby. We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy about it?" Victoria asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Yates said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have given me everything, Victoria. A home, a purpose, a love I never expected. And now a child. I do not have words for how much you mean to me." Victoria blinked back tears. "You have given me just as much. You saved me, Yates. Not just from poverty or an uncertain future, but from a life without passion, without real love. You showed me what it means to choose happiness over obligation." "We saved each other," Yates said, kissing her forehead. "And now we get to build something new together." Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1880, entering the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the cabin. Mrs. Carson and Mrs. Patterson attended the birth, both of them experienced with delivering babies, while Yates paced outside in the snow, nearly going mad with worry, when Mrs. Carson finally opened the door and invited him in. Yates rushed to Victoria's side. She was exhausted, her hair damp with sweat, but she had never looked more beautiful to him. And in her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was their son. "Meet your father," Victoria whispered to the baby, then looked up at Yates with eyes shining. What should we name him? They had discussed names for months, unable to agree. But now, looking at his tiny son's face, Yates knew. "James," he said, "after your father." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Are you certain?" "I am certain. Your father gave me you in a way. This is the least I can do to honor his memory." "James Jennings," Victoria said, testing the name. "It is perfect." Baby James was colicky and demanding, keeping them awake for weeks. But Victoria had never been happier, even in her exhaustion. She would walk the floor with him at 3 in the morning, singing softly, while Yates dozed in a chair nearby, ready to take over when she needed rest. Thomas and Sarah came to visit when James was 2 weeks old, bringing gifts and admiring the baby with appropriate enthusiasm. Sarah was expecting herself. She confided to Victoria, due in the summer. "Our children will grow up together," Sarah said happily. "Cousins close in age." "That will be wonderful," Victoria agreed and meant it. She harbored no lingering awkwardness about Thomas, no regret about the path not taken. She had what she wanted, what she needed, and watching Yates hold their son with such tender care, she knew she had made the right choice. The years that followed were full and rich. James grew into a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, fearless with horses, and always covered in dirt from exploring the ranch. Victoria had 2 more children in quick succession, a daughter they named Margaret after Yates's mother, and another son they called Daniel. The ranch prospered. Yates's reputation as a horse breeder spread, and buyers came from as far as Denver and Cheyenne to purchase his stock. Victoria managed the household and the finances, and she also started a small business of her own, selling preserves and baked goods to the stores in Breckenridge. Between them, they built something solid and lasting. They had their struggles too. There was a hard winter when they lost several horses to illness. There was the year the creek flooded and damaged their barn, requiring expensive repairs. There were the normal trials of raising children: illnesses, injuries, the constant worry that came with parenthood. But through it all, they had each other. Victoria never tired of the way Yates looked at her, as if she were still the most fascinating person in his world. Yates never stopped being grateful that she had chosen him, had seen past the practical arrangement to what they could build together. On their 10th anniversary, Yates took Victoria back to the spot where he had first kissed her, by the corral where they had cleaned fish together all those years ago. The children were with Thomas and Sarah for the weekend, and they had the ranch to themselves. "Do you remember what you said to me that day?" Yates asked, pulling Victoria into his arms. "I said I was meant for your brother," Victoria replied, smiling up at him. "And I told you that fate clearly had better plans for us," Yates finished. "I believed it then, and I believe it even more now. Every day with you has been better than I ever imagined. Even the hard days," Victoria teased. "The days when the children are screaming and the horses are sick and we are arguing about whether to buy more land. Especially those days," Yates said seriously. "Because even on the hardest days, I know I am building this life with the right person. With my partner, my equal, my love." Victoria kissed him then, deep and long, tasting coffee and the peppermint he had been chewing, and beneath it all, the familiar taste of home. "I would do it all again," she said when they finally broke apart. "Every choice, every risk, every moment of uncertainty, because it all led to you." "To us," Yates corrected. "To us," Victoria agreed. They stood there in the afternoon sunlight, holding each other, surrounded by the life they had built together. In the distance, their horses grazed peacefully. The cabin they had expanded twice to accommodate their growing family stood solid and welcoming. The mountains rose around them, constant and beautiful. Victoria thought about that frightened girl who had stepped off the stagecoach 10 years ago, desperate and alone, clinging to a practical arrangement as her only hope. That girl had been so afraid of making the wrong choice, of ending up trapped and unhappy. But that girl had been braver than she knew. She had been willing to listen to her heart even when it led her in an unexpected direction. She had been willing to risk scandal and disapproval for the chance at real love, and she had found it. Against all odds, despite all the complications and obstacles, she had found it. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, sensing her reflective mood. "About fate," Victoria said. "About how sometimes the best things come from our plans falling apart. About how grateful I am that I was meant for your brother, because if I had not been, I never would have found you." Yates laughed and pulled her close. "Fate clearly had better plans for us," he said again. The words that had become their private motto, their reminder that some things were meant to be even when they seemed impossible. "Yes," Victoria said, resting her head against his chest and listening to his heartbeat, steady and sure. "Yes, fate definitely had better plans." As the sun sank toward the mountain peaks and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, they walked back to the cabin hand in hand. There would be more years ahead, more challenges and joys, more children born and raised, more horses bred and sold, more seasons of plenty and seasons of struggle. But they would face it all together, these two people who had found each other in the most unexpected way, who had chosen love over obligation, passion over practicality, each other over everything else. The door to their cabin stood open, welcoming them home. Yates paused on the threshold and looked at Victoria with such love that it took her breath away even after 10 years of marriage. "Ready?" he asked, though he was not talking about entering the cabin. He was asking something bigger, something that encompassed all the years stretching before them, all the unknown adventures and challenges and joys. Victoria smiled and squeezed his hand. "With you, always." They stepped inside together, closing the door behind them, and the Colorado twilight settled softly over the ranch they had built with their own hands and their own love. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and one of the horses whinnied a sleepy response. The creek burbled over stones, and the aspen leaves whispered in the evening breeze. And inside the cabin, warmed by firelight and filled with love, Yates and Victoria Jennings began another evening of their unexpected, impossible, absolutely perfect life together. It was a life that had started with a practical arrangement and transformed into the greatest love story either of them had ever known. A life built on risk and choice, on listening to the heart instead of the head, on believing that sometimes fate knows better than our carefully laid plans. Years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their story. James grew into a responsible young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Margaret proved to have a gift with horses that rivaled Yates's own. Daniel was the dreamer, always with his nose in a book, talking about becoming a lawyer or a teacher someday. Victoria and Yates encouraged all three children to follow their own paths while instilling in them the values that had guided their own lives. Hard work, integrity, the courage to choose love and happiness even when it was not the easy path. Thomas and Sarah remained close friends, their families intertwining as the children grew up together. Thomas's carpentry business thrived, and he built many of the new buildings in Breckenridge as the town continued to grow. Sarah gave him 4 children, and while their household was quieter than the boisterous chaos at the Jennings ranch, it was no less filled with love. Sometimes, usually late at night when the house was finally quiet and they were alone in their bed, Victoria and Yates would talk about the strangeness of how their life had begun. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had married Thomas?" Yates asked one night, his fingers threading through her hair. "Not really," Victoria said honestly. "It seems like a different life, one that belonged to a different person. I am who I am because of the choices I made because I chose you. I cannot imagine being anyone else." "I think about it sometimes," Yates admitted. "I think about seeing you step off that stagecoach and knowing, just knowing, that you were supposed to be mine even though you had come from my brother. It was the most powerful feeling I have ever had, like fate was screaming at me to pay attention." "I felt it too," Victoria confessed. "I tried so hard to ignore it, to do what I was supposed to do, but from that first moment you were the one who made my heart race. Thomas was kind, but you were inevitable." "Inevitable," Yates repeated, smiling in the darkness. "I like that." "We were inevitable." "We were," Victoria agreed, snuggling closer to him. "And we still are." One particularly memorable spring, when Victoria was 40 years old and their youngest son Daniel was preparing to leave for college in Denver, they decided to take a trip back east. Victoria had not returned to Philadelphia since leaving 20 years earlier, and she wanted to visit her parents' graves, to show Yates where she had grown up. They made the journey by train now, so different from Victoria's original terrified stagecoach ride west. They held hands as they watched the landscape change, the mountains giving way to plains, then to the familiar cities of the east. Philadelphia had changed, grown larger and more industrial. Victoria barely recognized some of the streets. But she found the cemetery where her parents were buried and stood before their graves with Yates beside her, his hand warm and steady on her back. "Thank you," she said quietly to the headstones. "Thank you for raising me to be strong enough to take the risk, to leave everything behind, to follow my heart even when it led me somewhere unexpected. I miss you every day, but I want you to know that I am happy. So very happy." Yates squeezed her shoulder, and Victoria leaned into him, feeling the rightness of it, the circle completing itself. She had left this place broken and desperate. She was returning whole and loved and successful, with a partner who had stood beside her through everything. They visited Victoria's old neighborhood, walking past the house where she had grown up. It looked smaller than she remembered, shabbier. A different family lived there now, children playing in the yard. Victoria watched them for a moment, thinking about her own children back in Colorado, probably driving Thomas and Sarah crazy while staying with them. "Ready to go home?" Yates asked gently. Victoria nodded. "Yes, I am ready." Home was not Philadelphia anymore. Home was a ranch in the Colorado mountains. A cabin full of memories, horses grazing in meadows, and 3 grown children who were building their own lives but who still came home for Sunday dinners when they could. Home was Yates, always Yates, the man who had seen her truly from the very beginning, who had been patient when she needed time, persistent when she needed pushing, and steadfast through 20 years of marriage. They returned to Colorado as spring was giving way to summer, and it felt like breathing properly again after being underwater. The thin mountain air, the scent of pine, the sight of their ranch spread out below as they came over the ridge, it all made Victoria's heart swell with love and belonging. Their children came home that weekend to welcome them back. James brought his new wife Emma, a cheerful girl from town who was not afraid of hard work. Margaret came with tales of a horse she was training that was giving her trouble. Daniel arrived from Denver with a trunk full of books and stories about his classes. They gathered around the big table that Yates had built years ago, expanded several times to accommodate their growing family. Victoria cooked their favorite meal, roast chicken and potatoes and vegetables from her garden, while the house filled with laughter and conversation. Looking around at her family, Victoria felt a wave of gratitude so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. All of this, every single bit of it, had come from one terrified leap of faith 20 years ago, from getting on that stagecoach, from being willing to marry a stranger, from having the courage to follow her heart when it led her somewhere unexpected. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, noticing her mother's expression. "You look like you are about to cry." "I am just happy," Victoria said simply. "So grateful for all of you, for this life we have built together." "Getting sentimental in your old age, Ma," James teased gently. "Maybe I am," Victoria admitted. "Or maybe I am just old enough to appreciate what I have." "You are not old," Yates protested. "We are in our prime. We have years ahead of us yet." "Many years," Victoria agreed, smiling at him across the table, seeing the love in his eyes that had never dimmed, never wavered through 2 decades of life together. After dinner, as the children cleaned up and argued good-naturedly over whose turn it was to wash dishes, Yates and Victoria slipped outside to their favorite spot on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. 20 years, Yates said, putting his arm around Victoria's shoulders. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like yesterday that I saw you stepping off that stagecoach. I was so scared," Victoria remembered. "So certain I was making a terrible mistake coming here. And I suppose in a way I was. I had no idea what I was getting into, but it was also the best decision I ever made." "The best decision we both made," Yates corrected. "I could have let you marry Thomas, could have stayed silent about my feelings, could have told myself that your arrangement with my brother was none of my business. But you did not," Victoria said, turning in his embrace to face him. "You were brave enough to speak up, to risk everything, to tell me that fate had better plans." "And I was right," Yates said, grinning. "You were right," Victoria agreed. She stood on her toes to kiss him, a soft, lingering kiss that still made her heart flutter even after 20 years. "Thank you for being right. Thank you for not letting me settle. Thank you for showing me what love could really be." "Thank you for choosing me," Yates replied. "For seeing past the scandal and the complications. For being brave enough to follow your heart." From inside the cabin, they could hear their children laughing. Margaret's voice raised in mock outrage at something Daniel had said, James's deeper voice trying to mediate. It was the sound of family, of home, of the life they had built together from nothing but love and determination. "We did well," Victoria said softly. "Did we not?" "We did better than well," Yates said. "We built something real and lasting, something worth having." "Something inevitable," Victoria said, echoing their conversation from years before. "Inevitable," Yates agreed, pulling her close. "We were always inevitable." They stood there as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, holding each other, surrounded by the life they had created. Inside, their children continued their banter, their voices a reminder of the future unfolding. Around them, the ranch settled into nighttime quiet, horses sleeping in their stalls, chickens roosting, the creek murmuring its eternal song. And Victoria thought about that girl on the stagecoach, so frightened and alone, clutching a photograph of a man she was supposed to marry. She thought about how that girl could never have imagined this moment, this life, this deep and abiding love. "I was meant for your brother," Victoria said suddenly, speaking the words that had defined the beginning of their story. Yates smiled, that slow, warm smile that she loved. "Fate clearly had better plans for us." "The best plans," Victoria said, and kissed him again under the stars that watched over their Colorado home, the same stars that had witnessed their unlikely beginning, and now shone down on their enduring love. The years ahead would bring changes, as years always do. James and Emma would eventually take over running the ranch, allowing Yates and Victoria to slow down a bit, to travel more, to spend their days in quieter pursuits. Margaret would marry a rancher from a neighboring county, combining their operations and becoming one of the most successful horse breeders in Colorado. Daniel would indeed become a lawyer, working in Denver but coming home often, bringing his own family to visit. There would be grandchildren, many grandchildren filling the ranch with noise and joy, learning to ride horses almost before they could walk, running wild through the same meadows where their parents and grandparents had played. There would be losses too, because that is the nature of life. Friends would pass on. Thomas would die at 65, too young, leaving Sarah bereft until Victoria helped her find purpose again. There would be hard winters and dry summers, financial setbacks and family disagreements, but through it all, Yates and Victoria would remain each other's constant. On their 40th anniversary, they would renew their vows in the same church where they had married, surrounded by children and grandchildren and half the town of Breckenridge. On their 50th, they would sit on their porch with gnarled hands clasped together, watching the sunset and marveling that they had been given so many years. And always, always, they would remember that moment when everything changed. When Victoria stepped off a stagecoach to marry one man and ended up falling in love with another. When Yates saw a woman who was meant for his brother and knew in his bones that she was actually meant for him. When fate intervened and showed them both that sometimes the best path is not the one we plan, but the one we discover when we are brave enough to follow our hearts. Their story would become family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren. The tale of how grandmother Victoria came to Colorado to marry Uncle Thomas, but ended up with grandfather Yates instead. The young ones would giggle at the scandal of it. The older ones would sigh at the romance. And everyone would agree that it had worked out exactly as it was supposed to. Because some things are inevitable. Some people are meant to find each other, no matter how unlikely or complicated the path. Some loves are written in the stars, just waiting for the right moment to be discovered. Victoria and Yates's love was one of those. It was the kind of love that poets write about and singers sing about, the kind that makes believers out of skeptics and gives hope to the brokenhearted. It was real and messy and complicated and absolutely, perfectly, wonderfully true. And it all started with a terrified girl on a stagecoach, a photograph of the wrong brother, and the courage to admit that sometimes fate knows better than our plans. Victoria Monroe came west looking for security and found love instead. Yates Jennings was not looking for anyone but found everything in a woman who was supposed to belong to his brother. Together, they proved that the best love stories are not the ones that go according to plan, but the ones that surprise us, challenge us, change us, and ultimately complete us. They built a life in the wild Colorado mountains, raised strong children, created a legacy that would endure for generations. But more than any of that, they loved each other fiercely, faithfully, completely from that first improbable meeting until their last shared breath decades later. And if you asked either of them, even at the very end, whether they would change anything about their story, they would have smiled and shaken their heads, because this was exactly where they were meant to be. This was exactly who they were meant to be with. Victoria was meant for Thomas, but fate clearly had better plans. Better plans that brought her to Yates, that created a love powerful enough to weather any storm, that built something beautiful from an impossible beginning. That is the magic of love, after all. It does not always make sense. It does not always follow the rules. It does not always arrive in the expected package. But when it is real, when it is right, when it is meant to be, it is worth every risk, every complication, every moment of uncertainty. Victoria and Yates knew that truth in their bones. They lived it every day. And they never, ever took it for granted. Their love was their greatest adventure, their finest accomplishment, their most precious gift. And it all started with a single moment of courage, a willingness to follow the heart instead of the plan, and the unshakable belief that sometimes, just sometimes, fate knows exactly what it is doing. The end.